most psychedelic researchers don't tell you how they got there. In 1967, as a young student, I took probably what many would consider an inadvisably large dose of LSD. And I stood at the toilet and looked up, and there was a picture of a tiger on the wall and a poster. And that picture of the tiger became absolutely real to me. And I thought, I'm totally insane. And there was this moment of incredible panic as I looked at the tiger, and the tiger was breathing, and its eyes were moving, and it was staring directly at me. And then I thought, I've never been completely insane before. This is going to be a fascinating experience. And I moved over to the wash basin and started washing my hands. And I looked up in the mirror, and there I saw a young man with curly hair and two horns coming out of his head. And I was rather shocked. And I thought, surely I can do something about this, you know. And I realized that as I was breathing, every breath in made my cheeks rosier and my lips redder and my horns longer. And every breath out created a little slight pallor in my cheeks and my lips, and the horns retracted a little bit. So I tried holding my breath and making a kind of a like a Valsava, and lo and behold, no more horns, no more pink cheeks, no more life, no more vitality, no more curiosity, no more excitement, no more sexuality. And then I breathed in, and I found out as I breathed more and more, I was more vital and more alive, and I wondered why this was associated with the Dark Lord that I saw in the mirror. And as if in answer to my question, I heard voices from my childhood. My aunts were saying, that little Richard, he's such a little devil, he's into everything. And I realized that I had crafted who I was in order to appeal to people like this. And I had systematically eradicated aspects of myself that I felt were not approved of by them. And so began a kind of an encounter with shadow and an encounter with self. I fragmented into many different selves in the mirror and had a dialogue that went on for God knows how long with different aspects of myself. And at the end of the dialogue, I felt like I had resolved some of the conflicts that I'd been carrying with me up to that point in time. And there was a wonderful feeling of relief and love and openness and caring, and a sense that there was nothing left to do but to take that experience to others and to share it with others and to help other people to have that kind of healing. And then as I was turning to go away, I looked back and I saw a Neanderthal in the mirror. And then I saw a black man in the mirror. And then I saw an Asian man in the mirror. And then I saw a Native American in the mirror. And whoever I saw in the mirror, I felt was part of me, and I was part of them, and that I was part of humanity. And then it slowly started changing into the fact that I carried within myself a sacred code for life, and that it was connected back to the dawn of time, back to the beginning of life. And I turned and I walked out of the room, and I saw my then girlfriend, who was melting and changing and becoming all women as I was melting and changing and becoming all men. And I thought about, as a young Latin American man, I was supposed to be God's gift to women. But here was all women right before me. So I asked her to marry me, and she accepted. There was much more to that experience on that day. And when I came back, I told my friends, I found out what I want to do with my life. I want to be a psychedelic therapist. And they said, Richard, we think you took too much. It was a wonderful experience, but you shouldn't take this too seriously. And I agreed with them. And I looked for a way to get out of my commitment to marry my girlfriend and to go back to my pre-med studies. And clearly there was much more than that at work, because that vision was there throughout my early life, and it took me to meet Stanislav Grof and tell him about some of the experiences I'd had, and he said, you must come to visit me in Maryland when you come back east. So I drove 3,000 miles back east, and I arrived, and Stan was giving a talk at a conference, and I walked up, this, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, I think I was about 19 years old, Dr. Grof, do you remember me? And he said, yes, of course I remember you, Richard. And I said, well, I came to see the research center. I've entered graduate school, and I would love to come and do an internship at the research center. And he said, well, today something terrible has happened. Dr. Wally Pankey died in a scuba diving accident, and we're all in mourning. I don't see any way that I can show you the center. It's just the timing is terrible, and I've driven 3,000 miles, and Stan is a good bit taller than me. He must have been looking down, and somehow he saw this young guy was just about to dissolve in tears. He said, I'm going to call. We've hired some guys from Stanford, and they're sleeping in the treatment suites, and maybe if I can get their permission to bring you over, I can show you, I'll at least show you one of the treatment suites. And he called and was able to facilitate that. When I got to the research center, walked through the door, it was the most incredible and embarrassing experience, because I felt like I was at home. I felt like I just walked through the door of the home of my spirit. And I was terrified. I didn't want to tell anybody. It was right next to the state hospital, and I was sure it would guarantee me admission. Well, I met the fellows from Stanford, and they said, you have to tell Stan that you feel this way, because I told them how I felt when I walked through the door. So I did. And he said, well, we have to find a way to bring you here then. So that was how I ended up at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, doing work with psychedelics. That was the dream of my young life. And while I was there, I took about 6 months to get some background, enough background that I was allowed to treat a subject in a study with alcoholism. And I did my best, and at the end of it, the head of psychological research called me into his office, and he said, you did such a good job with this guy that you have to treat somebody with DPT now, because you're going to skew the study if we just allow you to treat people without psychedelics. So that was kind of my foot in the door to continue and develop my career as a psychedelic therapist. And then he said, we're investigating a new drug. And I said, what's that? He said, MDA. And we have an opportunity, you can have an experience with MDA. And so I was really excited to try this new compound. And when I took it, the interesting thing that day, the air conditioner failed at the research center, and Marilyn Summers, well, I lived in Panama for a while, and Panama is really the only thing that I know that approximates Marilyn Summers. It's sweltering hot and humid. So it was probably 100 degrees that day in the session room. But this interesting new compound that had part of the molecule was like amphetamine, and part of the molecule was like mescaline. And when I took it, I had this marvelous sense of well-being and was transported back into my childhood and sat with my therapist and went through all of the traumas of my childhood. One of my hands was warm, the other one of my hands was cold, and I spent the day with the warm hand kind of holding the cold hand and warming it up as I kind of brought out these different traumatic experiences and healed them in the session and sharing them. I was then given the opportunity, I proposed a study to use these compounds in psychotherapy, to use MDA in psychotherapy, with 10 outpatients, 10 people with different kinds of neurotic complaints, and was approved to do that. So what we noticed, I mean, these were such exciting days, and this new drug comes along, so the whole research center had to try it, and so the whole clinical sciences division had MDA sessions, and we all thought it was wonderful, and it was so deeply healing and so heart-opening, and something that what we said in our paper was where LSD demands internal process and demands inner exploration, MDA invites it. Mm-hmm. So for us, it was this gentle compound that we thought would have great potential for therapy. Well, when I started to use it with the subjects in my study, I was really shocked, because they went right into the most difficult kinds of experiences. They didn't talk about feeling good. They didn't talk about feeling love. They were immediately thrust into difficulty. And it took some time to realize that this somewhat euphoric edge that the amphetamine side of the molecule was giving was actually supporting people to be able to go into what otherwise they would avoid, what otherwise would be too much for them. But there wasn't any part of it that seemed so ecstatic. It just seemed like deeply facilitative of therapeutic work. I began looking around in the literature and trying to understand what was going on here, and I happened on this real gem. It was a book written in 1963 by Thomas Mortimer Ling and John Buckman in England, 2 psychiatrists. And it turned out that they were working with LSD, and a lot of people in those days were working with LSD, and they felt that it was wonderful because it would break the ego loose from its time-space fixation, and people could go back and relive experiences of childhood quite vividly. When a person would have a transferential feeling, they would often talk about it almost in a perceptual reality, like, my father was tall and thin, but you look just like my father, and I know that you're short and plump. So there was this kind of weird mixture of projection and deep insight, right in the same package, so that the qualities of the psychedelic experience were such that there was this added mirroring that tended to deliver insight, not just process. But what Ling and Buckman started finding in their day clinic in London was that when their patients would get close to something that was really traumatic, they would tend to project the negative parts of the experience on the therapist and on the setting. And they'd start to say, well, you know, I'm not sure I could stay here now, or could I get up and go to the bathroom? What could I do to avoid this? You know? And they were trying very hard with their patients, but at the same time, if you think about the qualities of relationship and the qualities of a vessel for a psychedelic experience, they were just at the beginning of the work, and they had really dry kind of psychoanalytic training, and so they didn't have much of a warm relationship with their patients, and they were having trouble. And they heard about this new drug, Ritalin. And Ritalin at that time, one of the things that it was called was a psychic energizer. They thought, you know, if we were to give Ritalin to our subjects, our patients, it's possible that the Ritalin would help them to have a sense of well-being. And if they had a sense of well-being, they might realize that it's okay to go into the experiences. So this wonderful book, LSD and Ritalin in the Treatment of Neurosis, is a whole collection of beautiful case histories of just what they did with this process. What they would do is to give LSD in a therapeutic environment within a dyadic relationship with the therapist, and then when there was difficulty, when there was resistance, when there was fear or some difficulty in going into the experience, they would give an IV push of Ritalin, and that helped the person go through that. They had one particular case in the book that is quite startling because it's accompanied by pictures. It was a young woman who had horrible psoriasis all over her body. I mean, in the pictures in the beginning, you see her from the neck down in underwear, and so you can see her legs and arms and stomach, and she's just covered with sores. And she began her series of sessions and went through a lot of issues with abuse from her mother as a young child. Very, very difficult memories of abuse. And finally, she felt like she went back to her birth, and she had the sense that somehow in the birth process and the pain of being born, that was where the abuse began, but it was also where she could feel that her mother was in pain as well. Mm-hmm. And she began to have feelings of compassion for her mother and was able to forgive her mother for giving birth to her finally. And then they have the after picture, and her complexion is completely clear, totally clear. I showed this, my friend Bill Richards pioneered the re-emergence of psilocybin as a psychedelic at Johns Hopkins, and I was actually invited to the same unit where he did that, about 10 years ahead of him, and George Bigelow was the chairman there, and I gave a talk, and I showed this wonderful black and white picture and told this story and discussed our work with alcoholics and how we had studies where 35 hours of therapy and one high-dose LSD session produced no drinking a year and a half later in 61% of the alcoholic patients that were treated in that study. And George wrote me a letter, and he said, "Richard, thank you for your presentation. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed listening to it. I hope you understand that most people here didn't believe you. And I was just floored, didn't believe me. And I called him on the phone. I said, George, what do you mean, didn't believe me? And he said, they don't understand how a pharmacological agent could have an effect on a person with one administration. That's impossible. And even in the study with the young lady where it was repeated administrations and it was Ritalin as well, it was too few to really be able to have the effects that you were showing. I think things have changed at Hopkins. I think they're seeing what psychedelics can actually do, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that's happening there. So let me go back a little bit to the work with MDA, because part of what I wanted to share with you are exciting tales about phenethylamines, about even Ritalin LSD combinations, combinations of psychedelic drugs, combinations of euphoriants and psychedelic drugs. I think they're a remarkable part of psychedelic medicine, which is just coming now. It's just at the edge of being able to begin to be a discipline. But the thing that is most difficult about this is that these compounds, whether it's MDA, which is methylene dioxyamphetamine, or MMDA, which is methylene dioxymethamphetamine, these compounds that have an amphetaminic component, these phenethylamines. And Ritalin and LSD is similar. It's like a euphoriant and a psychedelic. There's something in this that alters judgment. So if you think about it, we go through our lives, and when we have noxious experiences as kids, and we all have them, it's not unusual for us to say to ourselves, well, I promise I'll never let that happen again. And whether that means that we're learning to walk and we learn not to perambulate in the pattern that we were walking in when we fell, or that we learn not to reach for something where we got slapped when we reached for it, or we learn not to go near emotions that were shown to be dangerous. Whatever that process of building our sense of ourself was, we've got labels on it. Don't look there. Don't go there. Demons are there. Suffering is there. Pain is there. Behave this way and you'll be okay. And under the effects of the psychedelic, you have the possibility to go there, but at the same time, those warning labels are still there, and they still tend to guide you away from it. With the addition of a euphoriant quality, there's a different perception. Judgment is altered. Oh, this is a terribly frightening experience. I don't want to go there, but I'm here in this wonderful clinic with these doctors they care about me and they're trying to help me to understand myself, and what better place to go into this? So you can see in that description a wonderful positive shift, something that can allow for growth, but at the same time, it's like an alteration in a pattern that had to do with self-protection. So one of the things that I've seen over the years as we've gotten excited, MDA kind of passed through, the psychedelic scene was a love drug, and then it kind of faded out. But MDMA came in, And MDMA is such a wonderful compound, and it wafted in with the sense, this is almost, for those of us that were professionals, it's as close to psychotherapy in a pill as anything that's ever come to light. Problem is, psychotherapy doesn't live in a pill. But these qualities permit uncovering of deep wounds that would be very difficult to uncover otherwise. And along with it came this profound optimism. You know, it's so easy to work with. It's so easy to guide somebody. It has an inbuilt quality of a positive relationship. Beware inbuilt qualities like that. Doesn't take very much training to use MDMA. Now LSD, no, you might want to be a little more careful. Let me see, maybe a story. In my MDA study, I remember one particular patient, I'd found in the work with LSD and DPT and other psychedelics that sometimes when people were caught in conflictual material that seemed connected to parts of the birth stages that Stan talked about, like the third perinatal matrix where people are struggling to come out of the womb. Now it could be childhood memories that kind of layered over that, but I found that it was really helpful to offer the person some resistance, to say, you know, if I'd see them there sort of struggling, lying on the couch with something, I'd say, you know, are you feeling angry? Are you feeling like you're struggling? Would it help you if you could struggle with somebody? Here, take my arms and struggle with me. So this particular person was going through something like that, and I said, here, take my arms and struggle with me. And he said, great, and he grabbed my throat. And he started strangling me. And I remember watching the black cloud kind of come into my field of vision as I was losing consciousness, and I was thinking, you know, this is what you wanted to do with your life. And then I had a wonderful co-therapist from West Virginia. She was a grandma, and she was a nurse's aide really, but she was very highly experienced as a psychedelic co-therapist. And she saw this happening, you know, and she came over and she sat on him. This is corpulent, and Nancy was her name, and he was, I mean, shocked beyond belief, and immediately let go of me, you know. And I grabbed his hands, and we were able to struggle, and he was able to derive some benefit out of it. And he said, afterwards, he said, "I hope I didn't hurt you." And she looked up at me and winked. She said, "Richard, you take care of him from the waist up, I'll take care of him from the waist down." The reason I'm telling you that story is a certain level of disinhibition in acting out, you know, that there was an edge there where he really could have hurt me quite seriously. If I was alone with him, I don't think I would have been able to stop him from strangling me. There was another subject in that study, a lovely young lady who became very sexualized in her relationship around the sessions, and it got so intense. I remember the chairman of our department kind of walked by and saw her sitting with me, talking with me, and he picked up on the energy she was putting out, and he said, "Richard, come here," you know. You know, gynecologists, they always have a co-therapist with them. They always have a nurse in the room whenever they examine somebody. I want you to make sure that you always have somebody with you when you're with this patient. she became more and more and more activated sexually, and was able to work it through, and was able to get through the process of therapy and get well. But it was, I don't think I could have handled it. I really don't think I could have as a young therapist. When in the early 80s, when MDMA was not yet scheduled, and many therapists were using it, I ran across, unfortunately, large numbers of people where there was sexual acting out and difficulties, and where therapists would be involved with multiple patients sexually. And I think that's a particular thing with phenethylamines, that it is more than the general psychedelic population equality, and so it's another reason why I think these drugs that seem so relatively innocuous or easier to handle than the classical psychedelic drugs are in fact the opposite. They really take very profound training, and they need constant supervision, not of a bossing sort of type, but of a loving, caring, confessional sort of supervision, where therapists can come and talk about what the real struggles are that they're going through. And also therapists, co-therapist teams are really important for being able to deal with that and being able to keep the therapeutic process going in a therapy direction, and to temper the tendencies to act things out.
I remember once there was a person who was starting to work with both of us, and she decided that she wanted to be with Richard, and we hadn't gotten together, we hadn't gotten married yet, but we were definitely together. And she decided, and I didn't know this, she kept that from me, but she offered to give me an MDMA session. So in that MDMA session, she had me say goodbye to Richard and go through the process of letting go of him and, you know, sending him off, and I cried and sobbed, and at the end of it I thought, I didn't want to do that. And so, you know, there are abuses that I'm sure can happen because people become so vulnerable, and you know, your judgment is so completely not there that can happen. So, I mean, people become very vulnerable, and so the question becomes, what kinds of sets do we need to have, and what kinds of sets do our patients, subjects, clients need to have, and what kind of settings, in order to help make sure that people who are completely vulnerable, like really dependent kids, again, what kind of settings can we create that would make sure that people really heal in those instead of being re-traumatized?
One of the things I think is quite brilliant about the design of the phase 2 MAPS studies is on the day of an MDMA session, the person stays in the clinic, and they have a sitter that comes in at night and sits with them, so they don't have to pull themselves back together and leave. And they have this extended bubble of care that isn't just the therapist, co-therapist team, but at the same time they're able to stay in this bubble of protection for a long period of time. And it was, for me, it was like, of course this is the way to do it. Why didn't we do it this way all those years ago at the research center? Why were we sending people home? But we would send people home at the end of the day, and they would come back the next day. This just made so much more sense. And these amendments to the vesseling are really necessary, particularly when you have a situation where judgment is going to be altered. And it's not going to be altered forever. And it's, you know, it's a kind of a very useful rose-colored glass experience that can produce incredible breakthroughs and can take you into experiences that you wouldn't go into otherwise. But then it's really important to have kind of a frame for reconstitution, a frame for coming back, a frame for integration, where some of those judgments that have to do with survival can come back in, and others can be examined as they come back in and either be accepted or rejected.
I'd like to start out talking about ways of healing developmental trauma with psychedelics. But first I'd like to read you an Emily Dickinson poem. There is a pain so utter that it swallows substance up, then covers the abyss with trance, so memory can step around, across, upon it. As one within a swoon goes safely where an open eye would drop him, bone by bone. I'll read it again. There is a pain so utter that it swallows substance up, then covers the abyss with trance, so memory can step around, across, upon it, as one within a swoon goes safely where an open eye would drop him, bone by bone. The reason why I want to talk about developmental trauma is because I've spent my whole psychiatric career treating children, adolescents, and adults with developmental trauma. Every person that I've seen who has been given a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder has developmental trauma. They started out having something happen, or many things, or some pattern of things happen to them as children. And it made them vulnerable enough that they ended up, then when something really bad happened as an adult, they got PTSD. So the soldiers that go into battle, some of them come back and they don't have PTSD. But the ones who had developmental trauma usually do get PTSD. Or the firemen who go into the building, 18 go in, and some of them come out and they have PTSD and others don't. And why is that? So I've spent a long time searching the literature, and there's some things that are just starting to come out. So I see some people nodding your heads like, okay, yeah, you know about these things. So I would like to commend all of you on your timing, those people who are training right now, because there's an explosion of everything coming together right now. We've got work happening in interpersonal neurobiology, the understanding of how mothers and infants, or caregivers and infants, are really connected to each other in their neurology. And you're really like downloading your neurology into your child. And how when you're a psychotherapist sitting with a client, you're connected unconsciously in your resonating, and you're attuning with that person. And that actually makes more of a difference than any technique or anything that you're actually saying to each other. So and they're starting to find out that this is true with wonderful brain images. There's the brain technology for brain scans over the last 10 years has exponentially changed, so that we can now show, correlations between pretty pictures and behavior. So, get some water. So there's also a confluence of understanding attachment theory and even brain plasticity. The whole idea that we can actually change our brains by just paying attention in a certain way, in a way of being every single day or very often. So how can psychedelics add to all of that? That's really what my question has been all along. How do psychedelics actually, when we put that into the mix, how does that change everything? And what is the relationship of childhood developmental trauma to adult PTSD? And how do we really help people to heal? One of the things that I was very impressed with is that when the Diagnostic Standard Manual 5, the newest one, came out, they did not add a category for developmental trauma. I mean, they've changed a few things so that you can kind of stick it in the side here, but it was as though it's still not recognized, even though the adverse childhood events studies came out in the 90s, and there's been a ton of studies that have come out more recently through the National Trauma Center. Bessel van der Kolk was actually one of my teachers when I went through my psychiatry residency, and so I was really sort of flabbergasted that even though he proposed that the developmental trauma disorder would capture a whole spectrum of dysregulation in children exposed to interpersonal violence and pathologic caregiving, that was not accepted. So he started the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and created a consensus criteria, and so there's a lot more research happening in that. But I think of it as being almost unethical. It's like the largest public health thing that we could actually change or do something about is preventing childhood maltreatment. Changing poverty would be, I mean, another big step. So it feels a little strange. Here I am saying this, and another election is coming and going, and I'm not going to get into politics. So I ask, how do we first learn self-regulation? It's through the attunement and resonance, right? So we're like musical instruments, and as a parent, we can resonate and attune with our child, and the same thing can happen with the people that we work with. And if we can resonate with them and attune with them well enough, we can actually create a kind of vessel with them where they feel safe enough and secure enough to expand into the space and actually allow something to come up that hasn't come up. So I think of like the set and the setting in doing psychedelic work as alchemical vesseling. That we ourselves and our ego structure and our character we're like a vessel holding our spirit, and then the relationship with someone else is like an alchemical vessel. And I'm saying an alchemical vessel because you need to have something that is sealed and secure and clean inside, cleared out and open, and something that can stand increase of energy inside so that transformation can happen. And when you're doing a psychedelic, what you're doing is you're increasing the psychic energy. So you really have to have a really good sealed vessel. I'm sure some of you may have had experiences where you have not been in a vessel and you've taken a psychedelic. I mean, it's fun. You go out and you go outside and you play around, but the transformation, it's a little bit harder to have that happen when you're not kind of inside. A lot of people